بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. It's nice to see everyone here. Of course, I'd like to thank all of the many groups for their invitation. And I'm very fortunate that I'm sitting at this big table because, as Brother Ahmed was saying, both the issues of Islam and modernity, as well as Islam and gender, especially with regards to the discussion of women, are very controversial, very politicized, very sensitive issues that people often have very strong feelings about. So I'm going to be hiding under this table probably by the end of the session. Nevertheless, I do hope it is an interactive forum. I'm not going to take up the whole time this speaking, only a short portion of time. And so it will be good to hear everyone's views because both modernity as well as gender issues are something we all have expertise in by virtue of the fact that we are human beings and we deal with these subjects on a daily basis, no matter what background we hail from or what gender we happen to be. Also, I want to point out what Brother Ahmed very aptly said, that there are, in my view at least, there are a lot of open questions with regards to Islam and gender. Now, I'm not trying to imply that there are no answers. As a practicing Muslim, and this is a faith-based speech, if you can't tell, I'm a Muslim, and I am speaking from a perspective of faith. As a Muslim, I would believe that there is one truth, that Allah or God, He has the one truth, but we may disagree in how we understand it. And I think in the modern era, definitely the polarization of views about what the ideals are for women, or for that matter for men in Islam, has become very apparent. It's not like these are all modern issues. They have been around for centuries, but they're especially sort of debated in the modern era. And so, while I do believe there are answers, and I have my own humble views on what some of the answers are, I do acknowledge that many of these things are debated among all people and they don't agree on the answers. But in any case, I think if we can just bring up the questions, that's good. One of the things I've had to do in my life is teach a class on Islam and gender, which is generally something that women in Islamic studies always have to do. They say because you're female, you teach Islam and gender. But basically, I just ended up framing the whole class in terms of what are the contemporary questions about Islam and gender, and just looking at the different sides of those questions. Because there's obviously 1.4 billion or so Muslims and a lot of voices out there in the dialogue. Okay, so with these really big subjects that have been given to me today, I first want to start with modernity in general, Islam and modernity. What do we mean by modernity? Probably all of you would mean something else. I'm not going to be discussing modernity in terms of science and technology and progress, although sometimes when we colloquially say what's modern, we think of these mobile phones and video camera and whatever else it happens to be. I'm not going to use this definition for two reasons. One is, quite frankly, technology is not something modern. We've had it since the cave ages. People have had progress in technology and so forth. And now, of course, the belief that technology is the solution to all human ills and we'll find salvation through technology and happiness, this is a very modern view, which, of course, I mean, not necessarily of course, but which I think is, there is some tension between that view and Islam, or for that matter, many of the other world religions. And, of course, I have some very strong feelings about how technology is used, even with regards to women. I'm sure we're all aware there are materials available on the internet which tremendously objectify and degrade women. I'm not going to describe what those materials are, but we probably know what I'm talking about. But that's not a problem with the technology, that's just an issue with the usage of technology. But first of all, technology is not new. It's not inherently bad or good. But also, as most of you are undoubtedly aware, Islamic civilization did bring on an era of scientific exploration and development, of technologies, and so this is something which is very intrinsic in the Islamic tradition. Intellectual inquiry is seen as being in harmony with the faith. Faith and science are supposed to go together to help us understand God and His creation better. So I'm not going to be dealing with the science part of modernity. I'm going to be dealing with more of the philosophical framework of modernity. And that is what happened basically after the Enlightenment in Europe, whereby people define the modern era as the era in which there was a break between traditional religious authority, or break from traditional religious authority. So in the previous time periods, the church, for example, had a lot of authority over people, Christian people at any rate, in Europe. And then after that, secularism became, eventually developed, and basically authority shifted from the divine to the human. So religion was not really a public matter, as we know. It became a matter of personal belief, and other forms of self-identification became more common. Instead of defining yourself in terms of your religious community, you might define yourself as a member of a nation state, for example, which is basically how we are nowadays. I'm sure if most people ask you to say something about yourself, one of the first things you'll say is I'm Canadian or American or whatever. So there's a shift basically from the divine to the human in terms of sort of the focus, and especially the focus in public society. And I'm generalizing, by the way. I'm not saying every modern philosopher has felt like that, but this is basically the trend of things, which we definitely see today. And also a sense that human beings define their own destiny. So for example, to pick one of these very controversial issues, if we want to talk about human rights, someone who's looking from a faith-based perspective and who's an adherent to a revealed religion would say it is the role of Allah, or it is the role of God, to define what are the human rights. So you would look at the revelation and say what human rights are listed in this revelation. Now you might disagree about how you interpret the revelation, but the point is your focus is on what is revealed. Whereas in the sort of modern secular context, the focus is not going to scriptural sources, albeit, of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition has strongly influenced the development of Western culture, but it's trying to discover what human rights are as human beings. So human beings having more of an authority to discover or determine their own destiny. So therein lies really the fundamental clash with Islam and modernity. So I noticed there was a question mark on that poster out there. Does Islam clash with modernity? Well, yes, I think it does. I think that's what the problem is with Islam, that Islam is seen as the major world contender with modernity, or sort of the globalized secularist culture there is today, because there is precisely this difference, whereas in the sort of globalized, secularized culture that is very common today, and which is culturally dominant today in many regions of the world, the focus is on the human and belief is a personal matter, whereas I would say traditionally in Islamic thought, and my view as a Muslim, I believe the authentic way to look at Islam is that the divine is the center of both the private and the public, and the revelation should inform the direction of the society. Now I'm being slightly cautious in my choice of words, because there's obviously a lot of differences of opinion among Muslims. There's, even regarding something like secularism, you'll find different viewpoints, or modernity. But I think it's reasonable to say, at least, that a good number of the world's Muslims do genuinely feel that Islam should have an impact on how their society runs. For example, the legal system. I would say a good number of Muslims would like family law, for example, to be done by Sharia in one way or another. And this, of course, is quite different to what we see in the sort of globalized, secularized culture. So yes, there's a big conflict between Islam and modernity. I mean, ideally, now I don't want to get too abstract here, but ideally there shouldn't be, in that kind of the sort of, the philosophical trend in Western thought was very idealistic in my opinion, and the idea was people could discover the truth on their own. And this is basically a sort of unspoken belief in a lot of Islamic thought, the idea that because religion is supposed to be in agreement with reason, that if someone had a perfect intellect, they would come to the same conclusions that the revelation says. So this is ideal, but of course, in reality, people's intellects don't work like that. We have all sorts of biases and so forth.
which aspects of modernity are you referring to? Because the way it's in abstract seems Islam is old and modernity is new. So there are certain aspects that the clash you're referring to. Maybe it's better to just
Yes.
on that.
The primary aspect I'm referring to now is the taking the revelation as the source of direction for society and focusing on the divine and obedience to God as sort of the center of society and private life versus the secularist model, which basically says that religion does not belong in the public sphere and more of a focus on the nation state and human beings determining their own destiny. So that's what I mean by the clash here. And I think that's a real clash. I also, personally, I don't have a problem with that. I don't lose any sleep over that. Because it's okay to disagree. There's a lot of people in the world. There are different ways of living. We don't have to hate each other for disagreeing. I can respect someone who has a difference of opinion. Now, we do live in a world, I'm just going to be very honest here, indeed I try to be, where we're sort of socialized to view modernity as a very positive word. There are all sorts of words we're socialized to believe are positive: modernity, progress, technology, democracy, etc. So it's as if you're against any of those things, then you're somehow bad. There's a value judgment. I'm not saying it's bad that Islam clashes with modernity in some ways. I'm saying it is, and there are multiple ways to live life, and that's the human condition. So there are, I think, some real areas where Islam and modernity do clash. Now if we want to just expand modernity and get a little bit out of this philosophical framework stuff into the dominant sort of globalized, secularized culture, I would say yes, there are some differences in values between values that are encouraged by the scriptural sources of Islam. That is to say the Holy Quran, which is the primary scriptural source, being considered divine revelation by Muslims, and also the hadith, or the sayings of the Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him and his family. There are things that are advocated by those which are not popular in today's globalized, secularized culture, and in particular in a lot of the world media, or especially the Western media, are oftentimes portrayed very negatively. There are some very easy examples. Okay, head covering. You wouldn't believe how controversial a piece of cloth is, but there's a lot of symbolism around head covering, obviously. And I do believe the negativity towards head covering in the West is due to a perception, which I think does come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, that head covering for women is associated, well, maybe more from the Christian tradition anyway, associated with submissiveness and a sort of lower status for women. So therefore, in the feminist movement, there was an idea that to be free, women should uncover their hair. So there's that symbolism. In the Islamic world, head covering in and of itself doesn't symbolize that. For that matter, if you go to the Middle East, for example, you find many men cover their hair too, because quite frankly, it's hot and the sun beats down on you in a lot of countries. I'm not implying that most of the Muslims are in the Middle East. I'm well aware that most Muslims live in Southeast Asia and also the subcontinent, but I'm just saying that so sort of the paradigm is different. But in any case, for some reason, this seems to be directed at Muslims a lot, that in order to be free, a woman should uncover her hair. Really, it doesn't make a difference. It has nothing to do with my intellect or freedom or what I wear on my head. But the point is, this is a value clash, albeit a small issue. There are other issues that have nothing to do with women directly. Sharia is a big one. If I'm allowed to say that in here, I know Sharia has become a bad word nowadays in some of the media in some countries. You know, say, oh, the Sharia law is coming and we have to fight this Sharia law. And it's odd to see this. I'm fortunate to be old enough now to remember when Sharia was not a bad word. For those of us who are Muslims, we understand that Sharia is just the way we live life according to how we understand the revelation. So it's the religious law. And most of it has nothing to do with hand chopping and so forth. A lot of it's just very basic things, how you pray, how you fast. Also, there are legislative matters too. I'm not pushing that aside. The transaction laws, whatever. But the point is, it's not seen as a negative thing. It's generally seen as a positive thing by practicing Muslims, because the main idea of Islam is to try to obey God, to obey Allah. And the way you do that is by doing what Allah has commanded, what we understand, and you do that by following the Sharia. However, there is this negativity towards Sharia nowadays in some circles outside of the Islamic world. Well, outside of Muslims, I don't want to generalize about the Islamic world. Personally, I'm of the view, I really think this goes back to some of the clash between Christianity and Islam, and that I do feel there's a certain amount of negativity towards a formalized religious law, and as maybe this has to do more with Judaism and Christianity in my sense, or in a sense, I think. There's a sense that a religion that has a strong religious law is not necessarily so spiritual and so forth. I think that's where some of these perceptions might come from. But in any case, it's a clash. Obviously, in the secular world, religiously oriented law isn't supposed to be directing a society. So if you have a society that does wish to be directed by that, you have a clash. We could go on all day about clashes between Islam and modernity. I'm just simply pointing out that they are there. In general, with regards to women or not about women. Now, since I'm also supposed to tackle another giant subject, which is women in the Holy Quran, we're now going to move to that subject. And I would like to point out, first of all, while fully observing that there are definitely, in my humble opinion, genuine clashes between Islam and modernity, including with regards to ideals regarding women or other aspects of social life, family life, and so forth. There are also some ways in which Islamic thought has changed in the past century or so. That is to say, while, again, as Muslims, for those of us who are practicing Muslims, we believe that, as the Holy Quran says, the religion before Allah is Islam, and the Dina Inloes is Islam. So Islam is, Allah knows the Islam. But we as human beings, we may evolve in our understanding of what Islam is. For example, if you go back 500 years, you find some of the ulama, they said different things than Muslims do nowadays, and some of the things they said are the same. Because just as human beings, our understanding, our discussion, the trends of thought change. So I'm not going to be saying that Islam itself is changing in the modern era. As a Muslim, from a faith-based perspective, I don't believe that. I believe Islam is Islam. But what I would say is some of the way we discuss things, the paradigms or the approaches, have been changing. And this is particularly true with regards to discussion about women. It should be also fairly obvious why the paradigms have been changing a lot. Primarily because the sort of social situation of women has changed so radically in the past century, and people in general. I mean, if you look at urbanization and mass education and so forth, our lives are much different than most of our grandparents, I'm sure, or great-grandparents. And so when you have such a radical shift in situation, it sort of shakes up your ideas about the world, and you have to sometimes reevaluate things. And I think a very easy answer, or a very easy example to give is, again, a very simple example, and that is, again, the headscarf, a very over-discussed example. And that is, if you go back 100 years, I think it would be very difficult for you to find Islamic scholars saying the purpose of the headscarf or the Islamic modest dress is for women to interact in society and be a positive member of society, to participate in the society. Because women's participation in society wasn't really necessarily encouraged in a number of Muslim regions. Now again, that's a generalization. I'm not talking about every female, but it does seem that in the sort of 19th century, early 20th century, there was a very restrictive sort of attitude with regards to women in a number of Muslim countries. Something, incidentally, I don't personally think traces all the way back to, say, the medieval era. I think this is a lot of societies became more restrictive as the modern era neared. In any case, other topic. So you won't find that, but nowadays it's quite common if you listen to a lecture about the hijab or Islamic modest dress for someone to say the purpose of the hijab is so a woman can go into society and interact with people like I'm doing right now without being objectified or treated with indignity, and so people can understand her intellect and see her as a human being. So this is a very different way of discussing the hijab. Now, has Islam changed in the past 100 years? No. But it's just people's assumptions that they're bringing to the table about discussing Islam that have changed. And in part, I think, again, due to the difference in social situation. And also, realistically, people need to change their paradigms sometimes when they no longer work. And that's something I'm going to get to, because I'm going to have an honesty moment, and I'm aware that we Muslims do not like airing our dirty laundry, so to speak. I don't know if that's an Americanism or not, but I'm just going to be honest. There are times when we discuss religion, and what we say theoretically doesn't always match what happens in the society. And again, it has nothing to do with what Islam is or what the Holy Quran says. It's just sometimes the approaches we take don't mirror what happens. One of my favorite examples, I hope this, I mean, probably because I'm a female, but one of my favorite examples is when I'm listening to a religious speech and someone is saying, yes, in Islam, women don't have to work, but they can work if they want to. That's great. Now, I agree. According to Sharia, a father should support his unmarried daughter, and a husband should support his wife. But, you know, come on, I work because I have to, and I have to pay my rent, and I know a lot of women who work because we have to. So, there's a gap between the way things are discussed theoretically versus what actually happens in some people's lives. And quite frankly, that can be very alienating for a lot of people. And I'm just going to be honest, that sometimes pushes women away from the Muslim community a little bit if they find there's too much of a gap between theory and practice. So in any case, I'm going to discuss some shifts in thought, and then I'm going to discuss them from a Quranic perspective, because that's what I'm supposed to do. And of course, these are areas where we can get into maybe a bit of debate too. Inshallah, debate is fine. Okay, so one of the paradigms that we see, I don't know when it started, to be honest, but when you look at, say, mid-20th century discussion about women in Islam, one of the things we see is that there's a lot of discussion of women as roles instead of as human beings. So for those of you who do listen to Islamic lectures regularly, have any of you not heard the lecture that says that women are valuable in Islam because women are valued as wives, daughters, and mothers? You've all heard that, right? You know, our Fatima Zahra is a role model as a wife, daughter, and mother. We hear this all the time. Those are all very good things. Islamic teachings emphasize family values. Family is important. Kids are very cute, mashallah. I've seen a few around here. And family roles are, you know, we have a hadith about the responsibilities of a husband and a wife and a father and a mother and every members of the family. This is important. But there gets to be a slight problem when you only identify women as roles and not as people. Because we as women, we take on many roles in life. Honestly, probably several times a day. At one time of the day, you may be acting like a mommy. At one time, you may be at work. At one time, you may be a daughter. So we fulfill many roles throughout our lives because that's what we are as human beings. But in the end, we aren't a role. We are a person. And I think, I have my own theories about why this became a very popular trend of thought in relatively recent Islamic thought. But I think one of the people who did sort of pinpoint this a little bit, if I'm allowed to say his name, is Dr. Shariati. That was a bit of a joke because he has so many enemies, the poor guy. He died fairly young and everyone hates him. Incidentally, I mean, you know, I think it's good to consider any figure and take the good and leave what's not so good. I'm not saying everything he said was perfect, but he had some good ideas. And you may be familiar with his book, Fatima is Fatima. We're speaking about Fatima Zahra, peace be upon her, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, who very frequently is only discussed as a role and less often as just sort of who she was as an actual person. And he points out at the end that although she excels at all of these roles, and we can look at her as a model daughter or a model wife or a model mother, and these are all very useful things to do to get guidance in daily life. He says she's also something beyond that, and finally he concludes Fatima is Fatima, so she's herself. But I think he sort of pinpointed the issue right there. And quite frankly, for those of you who've read that book, and I bet a number of you have, thankfully some of the issues he mentions are no longer issues anymore. Like he speaks about illiteracy among women, which is not so much of an issue nowadays. He wrote the book, I think, in the 50s or 60s. I think in the 60s, or early 60s. He gave the speeches anyway. Anyway, back at some time ago, but some of the issues he mentions really still are issues that I think we face as Muslims today, which is kind of sad. But in any case, he pinpointed that issue there. And there isn't, while maintaining important discussions about family roles, and quite frankly, I think it's also good to have discussions about ideals of femininity and masculinity in Islamic thought. One of my soapboxes I get on occasionally is we have so many speeches about Islam and women. When do we have speeches about Islam and men? No, really, seriously, I've heard one in my life, and it was so inspiring that I went out and I gave one once when I was asked to speak about Islam and women. I said, okay, manhood is its own subject. There's a lot to speak about being a man. And I wasn't sure how well it would go over being female and all. So I was trying to be very tactful and, because I don't understand, obviously, the male experience. I'm just saying what's in the hadith and so forth, Quran and hadith. But actually, it went over well, so that was nice. But the point is, these are their own discussion. But also, when it comes to women, there needs to be something beyond that. And again, that may be, it may have been in the past. I'm honestly not sure. But it may have been in the past, like if you go back, maybe, in the olden days when girls got married at 11 years old and stuff, that it really didn't matter if you talked about women only, say, as wives, because that was sort of the society. But in any case, in an era where marriage is quite delayed for a lot of women, there are a lot of young women who just aren't really gonna feel in sync with that definition of being a woman, because they may be, say, 23 years old and at university, and they're not necessarily fulfilling any of these roles, so they want something else. Now, whether that delay in marriage is positive or negative is an entirely other subject. I'm just saying this is the reality of the world we're in right now. So that's one thing, but of course the more important thing is the Holy Quran. And what we notice about the Quranic discussion of women, if you really just approach it sort of dealing with it on its own and not bringing in other things, really it does treat men and women basically as human beings. In fact, I think it's quite notable that the Holy Quran does not assign gender roles to people. It doesn't say, for example, women you should cook and men you should hunt or something. Now I'm pointing out incidentally, I'm not against gender roles. I think it makes life a lot easier to have defined gender roles. But the point is, this is not something prescribed by the Holy Quran or even by the Hadith necessarily, but it's just a means of sort of figuring out how you're going to live your life, because you need some sort of order. In fact, if you look at a lot of the women in the Holy Quran, they actually really defy a lot of traditional gender roles. In fact, a number of them are really exceptional in that regard. By exceptional, I really mean being exceptions. So, for example, the Queen of Sheba, Bilqis, she's a queen, she's got armies, she's chieftains. She's not really the typical woman, and certainly she doesn't fit into this typical model. Or Maryam, the Virgin Mary, again, according to the Islamic tradition, when she has the virgin birth, she's not married, and she doesn't marry. And so this is a little bit, she's not engaged or anything. And according to the Quranic story, she's basically sent, she's dedicated to the temple, and so she goes in service, which is a very iconoclastic position for a woman to be in, because that's a male realm. So there's a lot of things about the women in the Quran that are they're sort of opposite to some of these gender roles. Perhaps it's just a recognition that women do come in all sorts of roles and situations in life. So if we go basically from the creation to the resurrection, since as Muslims we believe Allah created the universe and Allah will resurrect us in the hereafter and send us to the good place or the bad place. Inshallah, we'll all go to the good place, depending on our deeds. And one thing that's also very notable about the creation story in the Holy Quran, now incidentally, I'm not getting into tafsir right now, that's complicated. I just want to point out what's in the Quran, is that the creation story is not gendered. O humankind, we created you from one soul, nafsin wahidatan, and we created of the same kind its mate, zawjaha, and then from these two we spread out a lot of people, males and females. It's actually, in my opinion, it's quite striking, because Arabic, as you know, is a very heavily gendered language. And yet this doesn't really have any connotation even about who has primacy in the creation, the male or the female. It just says we created the soul and its mate. Now, of course, there are a number of explanations in Sunni and Shi'i hadith and tafsir, which you can go into later if you want. But the point is, it doesn't really assign any creational difference between males and females. which is, maybe different than, a lot of times when we think about being male or being female, we just sort of picture a sort of creational difference. And this is expressed elsewhere. For example, the very oftentimes recited ayah, which unfortunately not all people in the world still take seriously, even all Muslims, that, oh, human beings, we've created you in male and female and in different tribes and nations so that you know each other, and the most honorable of you before Allah is the most highest. Yes, now one of the reasons why this verse or this ayah is so often cited is because it's a sort of anti-racism verse. It reminds us that no one people is better than another, and we're all created different, with cultural differences and difference in gender. So we come to know each other also as one of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, I'm pointing out people don't always take that on board because there is obviously still issues with racism and nationalism and whatnot. I don't personally think that it's accidental that race and gender are mentioned together in this verse. Many people, I think, would agree that racial prejudice has a lot of the same dynamics as gender prejudice. This is why a lot of times you speak about women and minorities, even though we're a majority in the world. There are more women, as far as I know, than men, that we tend to be a bit more disempowered, like a racial minority. But also, this is just part of the beauty of the creation of God, and the best of us is the one who is most honorable. So this continues. I don't want to go through every single verse about women in the Quran because we'll be here a long time. If you look at the social responsibilities in general, it's also outlined as the same. There's a very famous verse, in the Muslimina wal Muslimati wal Mu'minina wal Mu'minat, etc. Basically, specifically saying that men and women, and it's specifying women. There are some parts of the Holy Quran, as those of you who are familiar with it know, where although there's no need grammatically to specify females, nonetheless it is specified to emphasize that these verses refer to men and women. It's saying basically they have the same spiritual and ethical responsibilities. And it said that this verse was revealed on account of a woman asking about where are women in the Revelation. So, like I said, these are not modern issues. People have been asking about them since the inception of Islam. And there are other verses. For example, there's a verse about the believing men and the believing women, that they are protectors of each other. This is in Surah At-Tawbah. They enjoin what is good, one of the religious duties, amr bil ma'ruf, enjoining the good, forbidding the evil, and establishing the prayer, and so forth. So there's really a lot of parallelism between the way women and men are discussed. Also in terms of, unfortunately, those who go to the other place when they pass on, the hypocritical men and women, they are equally chastised, so no gender preference there. And so on. There's one exception, really, to the way men and women, to this sort of parallelism where men and women are discussed, and that is when it comes to family law. For example, you have the famous, heck, in some circles nowadays, infamous verse of Rijalu Qawwamuna 'ala Nisa. That is disrespectful, by the way. Astaghfirullah. I don't believe the Quran is infamous. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that because people argue about that verse so much. Men are, you can say that, maintainers of women. At least from the context of the verse, it does seem to be saying that men ought to be responsible for their families and be manly by providing for their families and protecting their families, because that's what a man does. Inshallah, in the Islamic thought at least. So when it comes to family law or some issues of divorce, and if the woman is carrying a child and these kinds of things, there are some differences. But in general, when it comes to the humanity and the creation and the life of the people, there is a strong parallelism. So therefore, because this is rather obvious in the Quran, if you look at it, and also because the paradigm of treating women solely as roles just doesn't work for a lot of people anymore. Although it does work for some people, you still hear it. But I think this is one of the aspects in which Islamic thought has been changing in the light of modernity. So again, I'm not talking about Islam changing, and I certainly don't feel that we have to try to mold Islam to fit modernity or even to fit modern realities, but simply that there is evolution of thought, and it's not something new. It's been going on since the beginning of Islam and in every other religion too. So I'm not sure how long I'm supposed to be talking here. Do we want another paradigm that's changed, or should we open up the floor for questions?
You can continue in 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Well, I have to summarize another trend of thought in 5 minutes. Okay, this one, quite frankly, in my humble opinion, this one comes across a bit as airing more dirty laundry, so to speak. I hope that metaphor is not too disrespectful either. I'm originally from America, so I'm very casual. There's another trend of thought that became very popular in the 20th century, or like 50s, that time, regarding men and women, males and females. Now, again, I'm not sure how far, and you do find traces of it in classical thought, so I'm not saying it's new, but it seems to really have been codified in this time period. And that is this paradigm that says that men and women are separate but equal, and men have the intellect and women have the emotion. So this is why men need to be in control of women, because we're somehow dominated by our intellect and we can't make good decisions, and our intellect is not high enough to be the man's. Now this was sort of a common means of thought. I'm going to point out this is not this is not an idea that Muslims invented. You go back in the heritage and European literature and so forth, you find people saying things like women can't go to university because they could never succeed intellectually. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a society where women are not allowed to get an education, then of course they're going to be intellectually less than men. And to the credit, and by the way, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone, but to the credit of those who advocated these ideas, they were living in a time when many women were not educated or even literate, or at least their parents, mothers or grandmothers weren't. So, this is what they saw, this is what they said. But one reason this doesn't, in my opinion, work anymore is simply because we've disproved it on a practical level. We now live in the 21st century, right? Yes, 21st century, where even in much of the Muslim world, women are at least on the same level as men, sometimes even outperforming men in intellectual tasks. So, okay, the idea that women are somehow like not intellectually there doesn't really apply, and sometimes women don't like it when we're told this sort of thing. But there's also another implication, which I think also needs to be considered, and there's an implication that intellect is good and emotion is bad. So intellect will sort of guide you and emotion will mislead you. So there's also that value judgment there. Now, quite frankly, I think, this is my personal theory, I think that in part was spurred as a response to modernity, in that one of the sort of defining concepts of modernity is it's the intellect that's going to lead us in terms of progress and all this spirituality, intuition, etc. that's for the past. So by saying intellect is good and emotion is bad, it's kind of the same sort of thing. I mean, it's in the same era. We see a lot of these books about the Quran and science and scientific miracles in the Quran and proving the Quran through science, which is an interesting field of study. It's quite fascinating to see how scientific discoveries do parallel the Holy Quran. At one time in my life, I had the privilege of teaching astrophysics, and so it's fun to look at these things. But obviously, faith is something different from science. The science can sort of bolster your faith. You say, wow, I didn't know that Quran sort of matches this scientific theory, but that's not really the purpose of faith. It's just sort of like frosting, so to speak. In any case, so this idea sort of came out. But also there's, and it doesn't necessarily always work in today's world. And even if you look at some of the more recent scholarship from people who I would still consider to be fairly conservative. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the scholar by the name of Mahdi Mahrizi, I believe. He writes mostly in Farsi, because I'm doing my PhD on Hadith. He writes a lot about Hadith and women, so I've looked through some of his work. I noticed he's sort of very delicately sort of disproved this paradigm in some areas. So, you see it changing, but you also see the paradigm used quite a bit in this idea of this essential difference between men and women. I do incidentally think there are some differences between the way men and women commonly do think, but I don't think it's as simple as intellect versus emotion. But now we get to the Holy Quran, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about, and I don't feel that the Quran supports this paradigm. First of all, with regards to the intellect is not assigned to the male or the female in the Holy Quran. And indeed, in the Islamic tradition, the intellect is supposed to be one of the sort of the sense that leads someone towards faith, so it does have a faith aspect. But both men and women in the Holy Quran have the intellect. In fact, well, really, most people in the Holy Quran have a fair amount of intellect. And again, a very classic example is the Queen of Sheba, in that she's very sharp in how she deals with Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. So for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the Quranic version of the story, she's ruling a kingdom which is sun worshippers, so they don't worship God. And then the Prophet Solomon or Sulaiman alayhi salam, and he finds out about this. He sends her a letter inviting her to worship Allah and become a monotheist. So she basically has to decide what to do, and there's the question of should they go to war, and she's very conscious of the consequences of war. She considers her different options. She tests Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, and then after the end of sort of exploring everything, she decides that she's convinced that Solomon or Sulaiman alayhi salam is a prophet, and she should worship Allah. So in the end, she's portrayed as being very intellectually there. Or even if you look at an example like the mother of Moses, or Musa, obviously her situation is quite different. She gives birth to this baby, and she's in a situation where the Pharaoh is killing all of the babies, so from the children of Israel, so she needs to put the baby in the river Nile, because this is the divine inspiration or revelation that has been given to her. Now, of course, this is not really what a mother wants to do. Mothers don't normally put their children in the river and just set them adrift, even if they trust that Allah will take care of them, because it's against your emotions. But obviously she doesn't act emotionally and say, no, it's my child, I can't do that. She obeys Allah. But then also you see there's some respect for her emotions too. One of the tafsirs of saying that her heart was empty, some of the professors say it's because her heart was sad, because her child was gone, and Allah comforts her and takes care of that. But that gets to the point where, first of all, I've just mentioned a couple examples where women do act with intellect in the Holy Quran, and there's nothing that says they don't. But also, emotions are not portrayed as a bad thing. Now, of course, in the Islamic tradition, unrestrained emotion is a bad thing, especially things like anger and hatred. These things you have to control. But emotion in general is actually portrayed as a characteristic of the prophets, and by that I mean male prophets. It's in the Holy Quran, especially it's in the Hadith. I haven't done a comparative study, but I think it's even more strongly in the Shi'i Hadith, whereby one of the aspects of the perfection of the prophets is this very deep sense of emotion and empathy and compassion and so forth. So for example, Nabi Yaqub, or Jacob, alayhi salam, we know in the Holy Quran that he cries so much over Joseph, that he goes blind. Now that's very emotional, obviously, he's crying, and even though he knows that Joseph is alive, but still, because he's at this level of perfection, he has this level of emotion. Or for example, from the Hadith, one Hadith that always sticks in my mind, it's about when the Holy Prophet ﷺ, his young son died, so he had a young son named Ibrahim, and his son dies, so he sheds some tears when his son has died and he's seeing him. So some of the companions, I guess, felt this is not a very manly thing for the Holy Prophet to be doing, men crying over their children. So they say, Ya Rasulullah, what's going on here? So he has to explain to them that this is the softness and the compassion of the heart, and Allah has put these feelings into the hearts of people, and basically it's okay. So what I'm pointing out is just in this very brief survey that the Holy Quran doesn't really support this paradigm. First of all, that intellect and emotion are sort of divvied out half and half between men and women. But also it doesn't say that one is bad and one is good. They're sort of working in harmony as long as it's the right sort of emotion. And even the intellect can go the wrong way. I'm going to quote the Shi'i tradition now. There's a hadith speaking about the intellect, which is generally described as something that leads someone to Allah. And then someone asked, so what about so-and-so person who was very crafty and very deceitful? And they said, well, the response was, that's not actually the intellect that leads someone towards Allah, that's just someone who has a very deceptive mind. So the mind itself, it's like technology, it can be used for good or bad. But it's the same thing with the emotion too. In any case, I think this is a change in paradigm that has occurred in the past century. I think it is occurring. And like I said, there are many voices among Muslims. I'm not saying everyone has changed paradigms. You find a lot of different viewpoints. But I do think this is the direction it is going, and these have been some trends of thought. And quite frankly, I think these are issues we don't discuss often enough because, again, as Muslims, the entire Islamic world has been on the defensive for about 200 years with the sort of colonialism and European invasion of Muslim countries, cultural colonialism. It's a very real thing that during the colonialist era, that attacks on Islam were used to politically and militarily dominate Muslim countries and to get the resources. So Muslims have been very reactionary, we Muslims, for the past couple hundred years. And the fact of the matter is, when you are defensive, you can't really engage in a critical analysis of your ideas. And I think we're still in the same situation today. And this is particularly sharp with regards to gender issues, because as Muslims, there is a perception, and I think it's a real perception, that in many cases, women's issues are used as a way to attack Islam or Muslims. So for example, you have the US invasion of Afghanistan to save Muslim women from the Taliban, which I'm not praising the Taliban, but I'm saying women's issues are used as a sort of a cover for military operations or other incursions into Muslim countries. So the response to that is to sort of fight back and to say, for example, well, gender equality is Western, so we're not going to believe in gender equality. Men and women are separate but equal. They're not equal. And it's sort of a very adamant, politicized sort of thing. But again, when we're in that defensive position, it doesn't allow us to have some of the discussions that I think we do need to have about things like women in the Quran and so forth. So speaking of discussions, I think I've discussed more than enough. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of the questions or discussions.